In this video, we're going to take a look at creating textures by using toolpaths. So you can see that I've created a model that is 12 inches square, and I'm not going to create any vectors to start with. I'm just going to do this on a completely blank model. So if we go to toolpaths and then select down here to create a texture toolpath. So if I select that, you can see that it brings up a dialog box that, to be completely honest, looks like it's got quite a lot of settings in here and information. Now, what I normally do with something like this is just literally start from the top, apply it and create just a basic form of it, and then start tweaking the settings. So what we're going to do, you can do this over the whole model, or as any of the other toolpaths, you can use selected vectors. So you could do this within a vector. What I would normally do with this would be to use some sort of form tool. So either a ball nose tool or a V-bit to do this. So if I click select, and I'm going to go into my inch tools, and let's say to start with, let's say a 1/4 inch ball nose. So click select, and then it becomes active at the top here. Now, what you can do for this is, normally this will be whatever I used previously within the texture toolpath. If you've never done this before, then it will just give you some default values in there. So what I normally do is click default values from the tool, and this will just give you some default values, just sort of giving you a texture straight away. So once I've clicked that, come down to the bottom, and I'm just going to set up my material. And let's say that this is 1/2 inch thick, and then calculate now. And this will give me quite a large looking toolpath. So if I rotate around, you can see there's lots of toolpaths on here, and it does take a little while to machine it. Okay, so if I were to open that up, and let's just simulate it with the control bar, and I'll just select play, and you can see what's happening is the tool is stepping over and it's dipping in and out of the material to create a texture. So if I fast forward that so we can see it, you can see that it's given me this texture. Okay, so this is just the basic texture from the values from the tool that I'm using. So there you can see that it's given me this texture. So let's try changing the texture. So I'm going to delete the simulation. I'll tell you what, I'll leave the simulation on so it's fresh in your memory. And what I'm going to do is, first of all, take a look at the pattern. Okay, so you've got a drop down, so you've got straight line or selected vector. So let's first of all change straight line. Okay, so let's turn on the vectors, and I'm just going to create just any sort of smooth vector here. Okay, let's say something like that. Okay, let's change that to be selected vector, and then I can set that as a pattern vector. Okay, and then I get a tick. So now if I calculate that, it should look a little bit different. So what's happening now is that it's using this vector here to actually create the pattern, or to create the texture. Still doing the same thing, but it's just not creating that straight pattern. So if I were to say do something like, let's try something like that, set that as the pattern vector and calculate it. And then let's reset that and simulate it again. You can see that it gives me that. Okay, so you can set these vectors that you create to give you whatever pattern that you'd like. You can also change the pattern length. Now, if you wanted to, you could turn off the aspect ratio so it will actually distort the pattern that you've selected. So let's make this quite large. So let's say the minimum pattern length, let's try 3 inches, and the maximum, let's say 6 inches, and calculate that. And this should make it a bit larger. So now if I reset the simulation and then simulate it again, you can see that it's basically stretched that out. Now I could make it quite large if I wanted to. Let's say I wanted it to be 10 inches, what, 12, so the whole piece is only 12 inches wide. Calculate that and it will stretch it over that 12 inches. So if I reset that simulation and then simulate again, you can see it's stretching it over that 12 inches. Okay, so let's set that back to something that's a bit more sort of normal. Let's say 1 and 2. Okay, and calculate it. And then let's reset the simulation and simulate again so you can see it. Okay, so it's given me this sort of effect. Right, now let's take a look at the depth profile. So at the moment it's a recessed curve. So what's happening is it's going in at a curve, machining the pattern, and then it's coming back out in a curve. Much like the fluting toolpath, let's say. Now I can change that to be flat. Now you probably wouldn't want it to be flat. There may be certain times when you may want to do it, but it doesn't look quite right. So if I calculate that and then reset that, simulate again, and then zoom in, you can see that it's just creating a flat profile. So before it was actually curving out. Now if I set this back to be the original straight line, you'll see it a lot better. So if I go back to a recessed curve and a straight line, calculate that, and then let's reset the simulation and simulate again. Okay, so you can see it starting to come in and out of the material. Okay, now if I go to be a flat and calculate, and then let's reset that and simulate again, you can see that it's not coming in and out of the material. Okay, and it's giving me a different sort of texture. Okay, so that's what that flat does. Now you can also have selected vector. So the way that it comes in and out of the material, you can actually change that to be a different vector. So if I were to, let's say, choose that, how I want it to come in and out, click select and calculate that, and let's see what this looks like. So if I delete that, simulate again, okay, so this looks completely different because what's happening here, rather than just having one exit and one entry, it's got multiple because this is a wavy line. Okay, so this is giving me this sort of hammered or honeycomb sort of effect. Okay, so let's set that back to being recessed profile like it was previously. And then reset that, simulate again. Okay, so we're back to being that. Now you can also change the depth of this. Let's say that I wanted the start depth, I could have that deeper if I wanted it to be. The minimum finish depth at the moment is 0.1 inches. Let's say that I wanted that to be 1/4 of an inch. And the maximum finish depth, let's say 0.375, and then calculate. Now this will cut a lot deeper. So if I reset that and simulate it, you can see that that's cutting quite deep. If I were to change that to maybe the 1/2 inch, so I've only got 1/2 inch thickness, and then reset that and simulate again, you can see that this is going right the way down to the base. Okay, and it's giving me much more of a textured effect. Okay, so this is how you can control the depth that it's cutting. So let me put that back to 0.1 and let's say 0.2 and calculate. So let's simulate that again. So we've gone back to there. Now you've got a drive vector. So you've got the option to use a straight line or a selected vector. Okay, so this is basically how it spreads across the piece. So angle, let's change that to be 45. And this will rotate it 45 degrees. So if I reset that and simulate it, you can see it's now going 45 degrees. Let's change the step over. So you've got minimum step over and maximum step over. So let's say that I wanted that to be 0.1 for the minimum. And let's do something quite large. Let's say 1 inch for the maximum step over and calculate it. Now what you can see is this has spaced out quite a bit. So if I simulate that, you can see that it's spaced it out. Okay, now the spacing is how close each one of these is to each other. The step over is between each one as it goes across. So if I go back, let's go back to 0 so you can see this a little bit better. And simulate again. Okay, so now you can see, let's take a plan view so you can see this. And I'm going to change the minimum spacing and maximum spacing. So let's change the minimum to 2 and the maximum to 4. And then reset that and simulate that. Okay, so this changes the spacing. The step over basically changes it in Y and the spacing in X. Okay, so if I set that step over to be lower, so let's make that 0.2. Reset and simulate. You can see it's come closer together in Y. If I set that to be even lower, it should make it even closer in Y. Okay, now if I wanted to make this spacing in X be larger, let's say I wanted it to be 8 and 12. Reset and simulate that. You can see that I've got a bit of a gap here because I basically set it so there is pretty much a 4-inch gap in between each one. Now, if I didn't want that and I wanted them to be quite close together and all the same, let's change that to 2 and 2. Reset that and simulate, and you can see that it's now more uniform. Now the spacing, because I've got these sort of cusps here, the spacing is 2 inches for each one in the X. So if I want this to come over each other, then I need to change the maximum spacing or drop this down. So if I were to change that to 1 for the minimum and calculate it, you would see them start to overlap. So if I reset that and simulate again, you can see they're now overlapping. Now, where you can get quite creative with this is if, say, for instance, you create some sort of pattern. So let's say I create a star, for instance, like so, and select that as a selected vector. And now if I calculate that, it will give me that sort of pattern over the whole of the piece. So if I reset the simulation and simulate it again, you can see that I've got this sort of weird pattern. Now, at the moment, what's happening here is that I've got the minimum step over and maximum step over all set up wrong. So if I change that to be, let's say 0.01, and let's say 1/4 of an inch, and then let's see what this looks like. So reset that and simulate again. And you can see that it's given me this star effect. Now if I want to space it out a little bit more, what I could do is either make them smaller, so I could do that here. Let's say I wanted them to be 0.25 and let's say 3/4 of an inch, and that would make them smaller. So if I reset that and simulate those, you can see the stars are smaller. Now I could also put them back, let's say 2 and maybe 4. Let's do them quite large. Okay, reset the simulation, simulate again, and you can see I've got these quite large looking stars. Now they're all grouped together too close. So minimum step over, let's change that to 1, maximum 2, minimum spacing 1 and 2, we'll leave it for that for the time being. And then reset and simulate that. And you can see now they're much further apart, but they're also still going over the top of each other. So what you would need to do is change this so you got a higher spacing amount. Okay, reset that and then simulate. Okay, so that's how you would do it. Now obviously you've got the recess curve, so that's going in where the star has got its start point. Okay, now if you didn't want it to go that deep, let's change it to be 0.1 and then let's change that to be 0.05. Now every time that you calculate this, it will give you a different texture. So if I keep on calculating, you'll see the stars generate in different areas. Okay, so reset that, simulate again, and you can see that it's not going as deep. Now let's make them a little bit closer together. So let's say 4 and 7 and 4 and 7 and calculate. Okay, so you can still see that the spacing is quite large. Let's maybe make that 2 and 3. Okay, that looks a bit closer together. And maybe let's make that 3 and 5. Okay, so you can see that it's all starting to get a bit more bunched together. So if I reset that, simulate that, you can see that I've got lots more stars. Now you can also change the depth profile to be as before. So let's maybe change it to be, let's say that, and calculate it. Let's reset and simulate. And you can see that it gives me a different sort of effect. Okay, so it's going in and out. Okay, so if I were to want to completely fill up this sheet, let's say I want to make the minimum pattern length, let's say 2 and 2. So if I don't want any variations in the stars, select calculate, reset, and now each of these stars is going to be 2 inches wide. Okay, now if I wanted to fill up the sheet, just bring the step over down, let's say 0.5 and 1, and let's say 1 and 2. Let's just see what this looks like. Okay, and reset that, simulate again. And you can see that it's starting to fill up the sheet. So you can do some quite unique sort of textures by using this tool. So that's how you use the Texture Toolpath tool.